That was really amazing. I've got some questions, and I think they probably mirror some of the questions that we see. So I think you tried it with McLeese keys, and you found the performance was because many people really worry about the megabyte keys that McLeese has created, but it seemed to be a still a strong contender. I think NIST are still evaluating it. Do you think there is the possibility that McLeese could be used, and do you think PQ Connect is able to create acceptable performance with it?
Yeah, so it's, I would say, very important here that PQ Connect is not having to do key exchanges all the time because of this pressure coming from forward secrecy. That what happens is you have PQ Connect says, okay, I'm connecting to a server. And most of the time, you've connected to that server before. Your machine already knows that server, and it already has the public key, and it already has a tunnel set up. And so you can just reuse that tunnel. And if you look around for why TLS is not working this way, then well, the answer keeps coming back to the same forward secrecy problem that, well, people say if you're using TLS and you let your session stick around a long time, then, ooh, if somebody takes over your computer or takes over the server, they'll be able to decrypt old traffic. And okay, fix that problem in the protocol, as PQ Connect does, and then it's just fine to have a connection sitting around for a long time. You avoid the inefficiency of having to set up, do new public key exchanges all the time. When you're in a situation of a key sitting around, a public key being used many times for many ciphertexts, that's actually a situation where McLeese is more efficient than MLChem. I'm actually kind of surprised by this aspect of what NIST has done in their most recent reports is they're very focused on the case of you have a key, which is you generate a key and then use it for just one ciphertext. Now,
Yeah.
that's an important case, and that's very typical for forward secrecy applications. But there's a ton of applications, including NIST standards, which are doing static keys. And a static key is you have a key sitting around being used for identification, for example, or long-term encryption. And in that case, you're much less worried about the one-time cost of communicating the key between a client and a server. You're much more concerned about if you look at a typical lattice system like MLChem, then it's something on the scale of a kilobyte, depending on your security level for a ciphertext. For McLeese, we're talking an order of magnitude smaller. Again, depends on the security level, but typical examples are at the very lowest security level, 96 bytes. And then for recommended long-term security, we're talking like a little less than 200 bytes, 194 bytes comes to mind. And then, okay, so it's much, much smaller than the lattice ciphertext. Now, if you look at the keys, then that gets reversed. You have a McLeese key is much bigger. Yeah, for high security, recommended security levels, it's a megabyte key versus only a kilobyte for lattices. But then, well, okay, so the trade-off there is, are you using a key for 1,000 or more ciphertexts? If you are, then McLeese is less traffic. If you're using it for less than 1,000 ciphertexts, then okay, then McLeese is more traffic and lattices will be less traffic. And in that case, well, then you're faced with a trade-off between can I afford the security of McLeese, the system that's been around for half a century and withstood all sorts of attacks, versus a lattice system, which if you're using it for very few ciphertexts per key, then a lattice system will be more efficient, but well, more risk. So the trade-offs that we do in PQ Connect, what we do is the long-term keys are with McLeese, and that's the foundation of security. That's what's identifying the server, providing encryption for everything. If you are in the situation of an attacker is suddenly taking over one of the machines and then trying to decrypt retroactively, so the forward secrecy scenario, then we're relying on a lattice system, exactly because the lattice systems are, we don't want to have people worried about the cost of McLeese for doing the forward secrecy keys. So PQ Connect has that mixture of McLeese for long-term security, foundation of security, and for forward secrecy, there's a lattice system.
I mean, SSL and TLS should have been migrated away from years ago. Vint Cerf came up with this method that fitted with Ethernet and with the networks that we have, and we should have. I mean, the packets are too small. So I suppose it's the move away from Diffie-Hellman key exchange towards the key encapsulation. I think what you're saying is that we can store the public key because we're going to be using it again and again, and we can wrap the key in there. So I suppose that migration is is something that's a good thing. So LMS is proposed as one of the standards that NIST has, and I think that's a stateful. I don't know how they managed to do this, but it's a stateful signature method where you've got to remember all of your keys. I can't believe that we're going to go forward with this type of mechanism. It really needs some complex hardware to implement it. But you changed that stateful into stateless with Sphinx Plus. I mean, how did you manage to do that?
So there's actually a lot of history going into Sphinx Plus, and I always have trouble pronouncing SLHDSA, but if I concentrate on each letter, then I can manage to do it. Yeah, so Sphinx Plus, actually, already in the 1980s, there were proposals for doing stateless hash-based signatures. The thing is, they weren't very well optimized. And also in the 80s, everything, I mean, communication and computation cost much more than they do today. And so because of this, people just didn't even think it was an option. And then what happened with Sphinx and then Sphinx Plus is a bunch of people got together and said, okay, can we make this more efficient and revisit the idea of doing a stateless hash-based signature scheme? The original paper was from Goldreich in maybe it was like early 80s. And then there were a few other people looking at it, but somehow not realizing that it could actually be a useful option. And that's something where, well, in Sphinx and then Sphinx Plus, we said, hey, you can actually make this something like 2 orders of magnitude smaller and still have the same basic security features of not having to worry about managing state in your signatures, which is how most signature systems work. I mean, there are lots of situations where it's not too bad to use LMS or XMSS. You just have to be careful in a way which you don't have to for most signature systems. And so then it turned out to work smoothly. I think there's still, I mean, look, you can always find people saying for Sphinx Plus, we're talking, depending on the security levels, we're talking like 20 kilobytes or even 40 kilobytes, which in some applications, that's maybe a problem. And so, I mean, it's not the end of the story for everything, but there's lots of applications where that's perfectly affordable. And so I think that's if you're not constrained by cost, then the fact that it's only relying on a hash function to be secure is a very attractive security story.
And I think what's possibly proposed is that learning with errors and the lattice methods have a certain time window of risk. I mean, might be a few years before someone could crack them. So it looks like Sphinx Plus may be the public key of choice and the key pair of choice for the root certificate providers, because they might need to be secure for 10 or 20 years, and then the lattice methods come in. So do you think we're going to end up with some sort of hybrid PKI system? I mean, it's going to be hybrid because we're going to have elliptic curve and RSA alongside these public keys. But do you see the different levels because of this, the time that certificates need to exist for?
Yeah. So absolutely, any particular application, you should be looking at, well, the costs and security posture of that application. And that is definitely something that differs across different applications. The more you're concerned with security, the more you feel like, yeah, we should be using something that has a very simple, convincing security story. If you're constrained by cost, I think my usual approach to this is say, use the thing which is really well studied and then try rolling it out. And then if it turns out to be too expensive, then you say, okay, let's see, what do we have to do to make sure we can do better than nothing? But anybody who can afford doing something high security, well, that's to me the default choice. This is something else where I'm really puzzled by what NIST is doing with sort of prioritizing the more efficient choice and saying, oh, I mean, if you've got a choice, if you can prioritize efficiency and prioritize security, it's like I would say prioritize security, because that's where we're definitely having big problems. I mean, tens of billions of dollars of people getting compromised by ransomware, for example, and many other problems with security that we're having. Whereas efficiency is becoming less and less of an issue for more and more applications. So in the cases where you have a clear efficiency problem, absolutely do something, whatever you have to do to try to protect against quantum computers. And if you can't afford Sphinx Plus, then don't abandon post-quantum crypto entirely. There are some perfectly reasonable options to try. But in the normal situation of you can just afford whatever, and it's just I mean, it's just I mean, look at your costs, look at how many times you're signing things or encrypting things, and then if you can afford to do something high security, that's what I would do as the priority.
And hashing methods are great. I mean, hashing methods are solid for their security and probably will be for the next few decades. So I think your work on Sphinx Plus and also for the code-based methods, they've been around since, I don't know, 1960s and so on. Unfortunately, Maclise has departed. That's a real shame. He was a great researcher. It's amazing when you see the papers that they produced, like 2 pages, I think, for the Maclise paper, and you'll see Ralph Merkel's papers were really short. It's strange the way that our research papers have really blossomed in size, and probably these early papers were much more engaging than the ones that we produce now. And so you talk about hybrid methods. So I think what you said, we can't go from A to B. There needs to be some sort of hybrid methods in between. Like you're saying that NIST and the NSA is looking for us to migrate to full-on post-quantum cryptography and get rid of all of our existing ones, which isn't going to happen. So could you just explain what the hybrid is likely to look like?
Yeah, so typically, I mean, there's one story for encryption, one story for signatures, where both of them you can do something really simple, and it deals with the bulk of the problem. And the really simple thing for encryption is you've got your existing encryption mechanism. Let's say you're doing something with elliptic curves, and then you keep that encryption mechanism sitting there, and you just add another layer of encryption using whatever post-quantum system. And then, for example, in 2019. There was an experiment with Google and Cloudflare trying a couple of different post-quantum systems. They were called CEC-PQ2A and CEC-PQ2B. And then they had a bunch of users who were randomly assigned to A and a bunch of users randomly assigned to 2B, and they collected some data on how efficient it was and concluded, yeah, both of them are affordable. And then they said, as an important part of this, just in case something goes wrong with the post-quantum part of this, we're going to make sure to also encrypt using elliptic curves, which was really adding very little to the cost. And I mean, the software is there, it already works. And so that went great. Now, a few years after that, there was a paper which was completely breaking a system called SIKE, SIDH, and SIKE, SIKE.
Socrates.
Yeah, exactly. And this is a system which was exactly the post-quantum part of CEC-PQ2B. And if that had not been a hybrid, if it had not been double encryption with elliptic curves and this isogeny system, SIKE, if it had just been encrypting with SIKE, then tens of millions of user connections would have been exposed to super fast attacks. The last paper I was reading through on this was saying 11 seconds to break the highest security level. And the security level that was deployed for tens of millions of connections was much lower than that. It would probably be under a second on on your laptop. And so this is super fast attacks. And the only thing that stopped that from happening was making sure to keep encrypting with the previous system. And it was years until the public realized that SIKE was completely breakable. Now, is this going to happen for more systems? Well, we've seen out of 69 submissions to the NIST post-quantum competition in 2017, 33 of them have been broken. And well, okay, does this mean that any particular result is going to, going to have a 50-50 chance of being broken? Well, I mean, what's left at this point, of course, has gone through some review. It's survived this process for some years, but does that mean it's secure for the future? Well, it's just common sense risk management to say, if we can afford to do double encryption, so a hybrid where you're still encrypting with elliptic curves and you're encrypting with your new post-quantum system, then, I mean, hopefully the post-quantum system is fine. Hopefully it protects you against everything forever. But just in case it doesn't, don't be stupid about it. And I mean, not to say that my colleagues at NSA who are recommending throwing away elliptic curves, not to say that they're stupid, they're evil, which is different. if you're actually concerned with security, then of course you keep your well studied, trusted elliptic curve system sitting around, and on top of that you encrypt with your post quantum system, which is hopefully good, but just in case we've messed up again, at least we're not making security worse. And so I see some positive reactions here. Anyway, for signatures, it's very similar that you simply can just sign with one, sign with the other. There are more complicated proposals which are trying to do things like tie the signatures together or protect against some obscure possibilities or problems. But the basic thing is 99% of what you need to do. Just, I mean, don't be stupid about deploying post-quantum crypto.
And we heard earlier that many parts of the world have different timelines. Australia really finds strange that 2030 for everything. So I don't know how they're going to do this. They're going to have to disconnect from the rest of the world and upgrade all of their software. I don't know if that was a mistake. I kind of think that someone has misread a NIST directive somewhere because 2030 isn't actually that long to upgrade everything, critical national infrastructure, everything. The UK is 2026 starting to look for this and so on. But obviously, one of the key areas is in blockchain because that's all about elliptic curve, ECDSA, the EVM, and so on. And we have this massive infrastructure going ahead with public and private blockchains and so on. I know this is a really difficult question, but what's that migration? I mean, I know it's such $1 trillion question, but what do you think that migration from elliptic curve to something that's likely to be lattice, I would think, is what is that looking like?
Well, I mean, a lot of things are happening already, and I'm very much in favor of to the extent that people just try doing something and it manages to protect a lot of traffic, then excellent. So, I mean, for instance, OpenSSH, as I was mentioning in my slides, starting in 2022, they just said, okay, we're going to roll this out, make it default, and then, I mean, hopefully it's secure. That was a lattice system, and so far it's not broken. And then hopefully it keeps holding up. And same for like TLS, something like 30-40% of TLS connections to Cloudflare, which, I mean, they support post-quantum TLS on the server side, and they see something like 30-40% of web browsers are currently making post-quantum TLS connections to them, which again is a lattice system plus elliptic curves. And the more of this that happens, the more traffic gets protected, and that's great. Of course, at the same time, there's lots and lots of traffic, which is clearly going to take many years before we're encrypting it at all. And then there's even more traffic, which is going to be still just elliptic curve or even RSA encrypted. And still a lot of work to do to get that all protected. And that's where I find it so attractive to be able to say, use a VPN, for example, that just protects all your applications. Or, well, I won't repeat the PQ Connect story, but I think that anything that we can do to add another layer of security is going to be protecting traffic, which otherwise is ending up exposed. We're definitely going to have problems for many years. Experts have lots of different ideas of when exactly there's going to be an actual quantum attack. There's surveys from the Global Risk Institute for some years now, which are saying, okay, we'll talk to a bunch of people who are working on building quantum computers and say, all right, so when do you think this is going to happen? And there's this huge range of answers where some people think it's going to be just a few years from now, and some people think it's going to be 30, 50 years from now. Where's the truth? Maybe it's somewhere in the middle, maybe it's at the low end. I tend to think actually the low end. I've been watching this stuff myself, and I'm really worried about the risk of attackers having quantum computers before the end of this decade. And it's not like they're going to announce it. They've been investing, for example, NSA, one part of the Snowden leaks, which went by, which people didn't really pay attention to. There were a few news stories, but already at that point, NSA had an $80 million a year program. And we're talking like from the leaks were in 2013. And then 2012 was, I think, the budget of $80 million for working on quantum computers. Plus, there's a bunch of public information about defense contractors getting money to work on quantum computers. Already, I was giving a talk in 2012, which was tracing some of that. And it's okay. Does the fact that there was some money at that point, does that mean that they're a few years ahead of the public, or maybe just 1 year ahead of the public, or more? It's hard to say, but it's just in terms of risk management, you have to say, okay, there's sort of what we hope happens, which is quantum computing just completely failed, and we never have to have anything broken by quantum computers, versus, well, okay, what if quantum computers are faster than we expect? And what if the public announcements of, okay, here's the first demo breaking RSA 2048, what if the attackers already years earlier had something? And so, I mean, when I look at the range of possibilities, then I don't think it's crazy to say 2030 is maybe already too late. And I mean, I've done some graphs of like, here's like possibilities. What's the chance of having a quantum computer at this moment for the public? I'm currently having a $2,048 bet that there will be an RSA 2048 public factorization before 2033.
Wow.
And
what's the odds? What's the odds you're giving for that? Is that as like an
even bet?
Yeah.
And okay, now I mean, compared to the damage, if it actually happens, $2,048 is not much money. But I think that's still a reasonable median estimate for when it's going to happen. Could be faster, could be slower. Again, lots of people think it's going to be slower. I saw a question coming by in the chat of I mean, does anybody think it's not going to happen? Yes, there are some people who think there's going to be just endless failures of quantum computers to actually do something. And it's a sort of technology where at the moment there are no convincing demos. It's sort of, there are all sorts of interesting things happening, and you can see how the basic things that would have to happen to create an interesting demo, those are getting slowly conquered. But it is entirely possible that there's just going to be a massive failure, and I mean, failure for quantum computing, and which is great success for cryptography, not getting all sorts of stuff broken. But if quantum computers do happen, which seems increasingly likely, then we're in big trouble. And so it's scary.
Yeah, and what about the migration? The world loves RSA, and we've loved it for 5 decades, and it's kind of stuck, and it still works. I mean, the majority of the public keys that you have on the web are still RSA, and I saw the paper that said a 1 terabyte key pair would be public key would be possible, which would fit in my MacBook quite nicely. So can you give us your viewpoint on that RSA scaling? Could you maybe dismiss that companies can't just go to 4K or 8K or 16K and still be robust? What's your viewpoint on that ramping up? Elliptic curve is a bit more difficult when it comes to that ramp. I mean, you kind of hit a limit, but RSA could scale. Do you think
You
it
can
will?
do that, but so there's some very nice graphs that Sam Jakes has put together. I think the title is something like the quantum landscape. And what that's showing is 2 dimensions. One of them is showing the number of qubits that are in various quantum computers and how many you need in order to break RSA 1024, for example, RSA 2048, et cetera. And then the other important axis is the error rate of the qubits. And that's something where there's current error rates are still not quite as good as we want. They're just at the edge where you can start doing quantum error correction, but you need to get better before you can actually start attacking things. And what you can see in the graphs, and he's been tracking this for a few years now, what you can see is that there's progress which looks like, I don't know, could it be maybe 10, 15 years until it gets to the scary part? And the scary part is going to look like there's say an RSA 512 demo, which is something we can already break RSA 512. And then there's going to be an RSA 1024 demo, maybe a year later. And then there's going to be an RSA 2048 demo, maybe a year after that. And it keeps going like this. I mean, this is reasonable predictions, is that when RSA 2048 is broken, you're buying yourself maybe a year by going to RSA 4096. And if you go to RSA 8192, et cetera, maybe you're buying another year for each doubling. And so this is, I mean, eventually, if you're willing to go to a terabyte, then you actually are good. If you look at the costs at that point, then you start running into technology problems, even with optimistic assumptions about quantum computers. I'm not worried about terabyte RSA keys being broken, but I am worried about the performance consequences of trying to deploy terabyte RSA keys. And I hope that's not anybody's migration plan, is to keep ramping up the RSA key sizes. It's all of these things. It's one of the difficulties with trying to predict what exactly is going to happen with quantum computers is that, again, we don't have useful quantum computers yet. And I mean, it's reasonably clear from sort of principles of physics what quantum computation does. But then in terms of the actual engineering costs and how long it's going to take to put these things together, what attackers will realistically be able to do within 5 years, 10 years, 50 years, it's really hard to tell. And then for typical data that you need to keep safe for, well, maybe 10 years, depends on the kind of data, or 30 years for some data. I would tend to opt for the bigger things if you can afford them, but trying to do that with RSA is unfortunately not going to buy enough time. I mean, it was fun to investigate what's possible with RSA, but it's clearly much safer to use. Well, my typical recommendation, if you're going to encrypt, is to use McLeese. If you're having trouble with the recommended megabyte key, then do some lattice system rather than doing nothing. But in any case, these are certainly more plausible options than ramping up RSA.
I appreciate that you maybe push for time. So please say when I've maybe got another few questions to ask you, but obviously you've got other commitments.
I'm still good for the moment, so
Oh, that's great. That's fantastic. So do you think we've used the wrong choice with ECDSA? I had a great time speaking with Victor S. Miller. Really fantastic. He went back to the early crypto conferences. You probably won't remember them, but 1986 and some of the early ones where they were talking about elliptic curve, and nobody took it on. It took many years for elliptic curve to even be adopted, and then obviously there was the paper on ECDSA that scaled this horrible DSA method to ECDSA. But we're having problems because if you've got an UBI key or a hardware key, then that migration from ECDSA isn't going to actually be that easy unless the original seed for the private key is stored. But EDDSA is fantastic because you can keep that seed value. You can then derive your PQC key pair from that seed, and you can create a zero knowledge proof. I think that's one of the methods that could be derived. So I think the big question is that have we built a world of trust around ECDSA, and it really isn't great to move forward with?
So I do think ECDSA is a step backwards from what was available at the time that ECDSA was created. So I mean, what happened there, it was really deeply unfortunate. There were, so starting with El Gamal's paper in 1985 on a signature system. I mean, he was also looking at Diffie-Hellman for key exchange, but the real contribution of that paper was a signature system using, well, he was starting with, like, as you were saying, there's the DSA versus ECDSA without worrying about that distinction. We just pretend it was all about elliptic curves. He was, except for not saying elliptic curves, he was introducing an elliptic curve signature system. And subsequent papers were saying, yeah, here's how to do that for elliptic curve, and here's various improvements to El Gamal's system. And that culminated with perfect elliptic curve signature system, where implementation perspective, there's still things that you can improve on it. But in all of the dimensions that people were exploring in the 1980s, by 1989, Schnorr's paper really got it right. And then, unfortunately, then NSA came along and said, well, here's a digital signature standard, which gets various things wrong that Schnorr had gotten right. And it's really a regression from Schnorr's paper. where, well, when I was saying deeply unfortunate, Schnorr took out a patent on his system. And so for 20 years, people were not able to use the Schnorr system. It expired, if I remember correctly, in 2008. And well, from that perspective, it's actually justifiable that NSA said, all right, let's do something different and not use Schnorr's system. And then, well, DSA and ECDSA became popular as the unpatented choices. And then, well, eventually, 2008, Schnorr's patent expired. And then 2011, we introduced EDSA, which is it's at the layer that El Gamal and Schnorr and so on were looking at. This is basically Schnorr's system, which the patent had expired by then. And then we did all sorts of other details, right, of things like the curve choices and implementation related things. And so that's, I would say it was already, except for some aspects of elliptic curve cryptography, the choices that were made in the 1980s, if it hadn't been for patents, then basically everything would have already been right in 1989. And well, that's unfortunately what happened. And so this is a fixable problem, but of course, when a standard has a 20-year head start, it takes a while to get that replaced.
Yeah. And obviously for this connection, we're probably using NIST P256. And for blockchain, we use SEP 256K1. I think you've done work on safe curves. I don't want to open up a can of worms in this, but are, are they safe, do you think?
So we've seen, for instance, Firefox recent vulnerability. I think it was late 2023. So Firefox had an emergency security upgrade because they were vulnerable to the Minerva attack for NIST P256 and not for X25519. And the difference there is that's the sort of detail that well, among different elliptic curve systems for doing, well, Diffie-Hellman like X25519 or doing signatures like ED25519, getting those details right is something where this was, I would say, second generation of elliptic curve cryptography starting around 2005, saying, okay, what is going wrong in implementations? How can we avoid that in the design of the elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman system and then the design of the elliptic curve signature system? And this Firefox vulnerability is a perfect example of NIST P256 not being safe in the real world. You can define some theoretical notions of security of elliptic curve crypto where NIST P256 is unbroken. But when you look at real vulnerabilities, or there's another one with 5G, I mean, software just keeps making predictable mistakes, which we know how to avoid with the design of the elliptic curves changing to a safer elliptic curve. And actually, there's some statistics for TLS. You were saying this is probably using this P256. I haven't looked specifically at what Zoom does, but TLS, the statistics are now more than 80% of connections are using 25519 for doing
Oh,
key exchange. And that's something where it means that, okay, there's still the 20% that are vulnerable to things like this Minerva attack in Firefox from very recently, but at least we've got a lot of connections which are protected. So yeah, I think this, like, trying to get all these details right, make things safe for the implementations. It's also, I would say, a huge concern for post-quantum crypto, coming back to the theme for today, that post-quantum cryptographic software is generally much more complicated than pre-quantum cryptographic software, which is already going wrong in all sorts of ways. And this is a huge auditing problem. We're really having a giant regression in the quality of cryptographic software. And then it's really important to get this under control and make sure that we're not losing security by doing this, which is also, it's another reason for using double encryption, double signature. So make sure to use hybrids so that you're not going to be in trouble if your software is failing. Even if the mathematical system doesn't get broken, then, well, make sure that you're not losing security when you roll out post-quantum crypto by making sure that you're keeping your existing encryption and signature layers.
and it's a challenge to create proper crypto libraries. So anybody can do an RSA library and an ECDSA. And I think there are lots of warnings about using libraries because the methods might be rock solid, but when it comes to side channel analysis, then it kind of all falls down. So, what's that migration looking like? Is there libraries just now that are robust that we could really use for post-quantum cryptography, or what's the? I know there's a FIPS 143 or so that's been developed, and I think some companies are trying to get their libraries up to scratch. But do you think we're still lagging very much when it comes to developing post-quantum cryptography libraries that are robust against side channel attacks?
Yeah, there's definitely a huge problem here, and I mean, so NIST is trying to do things like, I mean, FIPS 140 level 3 certification, for example, and also common criteria certification in Europe. These are trying to look for implementation problems, but I mean, along with just are you using reasonable cryptographic choices to begin with? But the most of the tests that they're doing are you implementing these things properly? But unfortunately, those tests have just massive gaps in them, and there's all sorts of security problems that are not being caught by that. For example, just a week or so ago, paper that I was involved with, along with a bunch of other people, called Kyber Slash, was just presented at CHES 2025, and this paper is showing implementation problems in the reference implementations of Kyber, and this is 2 rounds of problems, plus somebody else found a 3rd round of problems where the reference Kyber software had to be going through emergency security upgrades 3 times to deal with these problems. And in the paper, we showed how this is exploitable. We also showed here's some tools which are able to detect this type of problem, and detected similar problems in a bunch of other software. So there's just tons of problems out there. And to be clear, these tools, it's like research tools that we're able to now deploy on a large scale to scan all sorts of things, which are checking for some problems that we've been able to exploit recently in post-quantum software. And of course, there's many, many more of these problems. Now, there's again, NIST is trying to do something, common criteria is trying to do something, but realistically, those tests are not catching the problems that we're seeing. I mean, they catch some basic problems, like tests from the 80s and 90s were already catching some problems, but we know all sorts of problems beyond that are real disaster for security. And it's not just timing attack problems. Sometimes people just have outright bugs in the software, and then how do we deal with that? There are some libraries which are trying to deal with this. For example, libcrux is a project which is integrating various formally verified software, and that's something which is the idea of libcrux is that it's making sure that all the software you're using, which includes some post-quantum software, it's making sure that that software is verified to work correctly for all possible inputs. So, I mean, of course, it's still tested, but in case there's a problem that slips past the test, which is often how cryptography gets broken, is by bugs which are caught in bugs which are in obscure cases that the attacker can trigger. libcrux is using formal verification techniques to make sure that doesn't happen. I saw somebody put up the URL in the chat. Yes, it's crispin.com, libcrux. Another project like that is S2N Bignum. Now that one has even stronger verification, more trustworthy, simpler verification, although it is currently working on MLChem. It has basically elliptic curves for the moment. And I mean, it's a general, as the name suggests, S2N Bignum, it's a library for doing big number arithmetic, so you can use it for implementing all sorts of mathematical computations, but realistically, it's easy to use right now for elliptic curves. It's not easy to use right now for lattice systems. And so S2N Bignum, yeah, if somebody's looking for links for that, then it's AWS Labs, GitHub, AWS Labs, S2N-Bignum. And that is, again, very strong formal verification. So it's making really sure that the software is working correctly. And it does cover some things we need, like elliptic curve crypto, and just big number arithmetic generally. And yes, somebody's posted the right, thanks for the dynamic, finding the right links and popping them into the chat. And yeah, these are, these are dealing with correctness problems. Timing attacks, S2N Bignum has better protection than libcrux does, but this is something else where people are trying to get it under control. Still a lot more to do, and we're still going to be faced with software problems for many years.
Yeah. AWS is actually doing a very good job. Actually, I interfaced with the team, and I created my first MLDSA key pair in the cloud, which was I was really happy. It only happened in certain regions, but I think they've rolled it out. So they're doing a good job, and obviously Cloudflare and companies like that are really pushing it, and Google too. Google are quite well respected in this, and obviously Chrome is the big the big has a big market. But you've been very critical of Kyber, MLChem, FIPS 203. I don't know what you want to call it. I liked when it was called Kyber. I think it's quite boring to call it MLChem now. Uh, but you've always been very critical, and it's strange that we've bypassed 512 and we're now at 768 for that baseline, and we're racing very close towards the 1024. So, and I think you've said it just doesn't scale. It just doesn't scale. It doesn't. You can't move the lever to say, well, I want some more security. It's basically and that, and then it's finished. Is that right? Am I being wrong about Kyber? Is is it that bad?
Well, so Kyber has limited adjustability. Yeah, it's really it just has these options 512, 768, 1024, which hopefully things are okay with the current rollout of 768. If they're not, then well, hopefully 1024 holds up. But if things get even worse, then well, really have to rethink things at that point. I think my concerns about Kyber are primarily not about the names of Kyber versus MLChem. It's not as hard to say MLChem as saying SLHDSA. There, I did it. But it's primarily about people not seeing the risks. I mean, everything we're doing in post quantum crypto is it should be terrifying. There's been so many failures, and somehow that gets swamped by enthusiasm and advertising. And I mean, it's great to be enthusiastic. It's great to say that this might protect us against future quantum computers. Hopefully it does. But it's there's been so much carnage in the post quantum ecosystem that it's really important to be careful. And Kyber to me is kind of the opposite of being careful. It's I mean, hopefully it's okay. But for instance, Kyber 512 was originally claimed to be as secure as AS128, and that claim is no longer looking like a reasonable claim. It's not clearly disproven at this point, but it's if you had to place bets at this point, it's unlikely to be correct. The only reason we don't know is that it's actually pretty hard to figure out the exact security levels of these things, which to me is another alarm bell. Like, wait a minute, how can we have a cryptographic system that we're relying on and have, if you look at the Kyber documentation, it says the Kyber 512 security level compared to the target of 2 to the 143 bit operations to break AES 128. The Kyber documentation said the Kyber 512 security level is between 2 to the 135 and 2 to the 165 because of known unknowns. Now, I look at that range and say, whoa, how is it possible that we understand attacks so poorly that we think the security level is somewhere between 135 and 165? And then, well, it's dropped since then. So all sorts of alarm bells go off for me regarding Kyber. Hopefully it's okay. 768 does give us some breathing room and better chance of holding up than 512. But I prefer things where it's clear analyses, comfortable security margins, lots more security analysis, not a moving target for the analysis. There have been 4 different versions of Kyber, and this sort of thing is scary. And so, look, I'm not saying that it's a disaster. It's better than nothing, and it's nice and fast. You can put it pretty much anywhere. In some applications, you might have trouble with, well, a kilobyte here, a kilobyte there. Some applications say, oops, can I have something smaller? And then you might be happier with a different trade-off, like I was saying for static keys, a megabyte of key, but only say 194 bytes for ciphertext, and that could be better for some applications. But most of the time, Kyber is perfectly affordable, and it's giving us a chance to protect against quantum computers. So that's great. But I hate to see the enthusiasm for trying to roll it out turning into things like saying, oh, it's definitely secure, and so throw away elliptic curves. It's like, no, that's a really scary thing to be doing. So be careful about the risks, and then hopefully Kyber 768 is okay. But just in case it's not, let's make sure we're not being stupid about deployment.
One of my favorite papers of yours is where you analyze the NIST competitions and you go right back and you're critical, but I think you're very fair. And you see things like Kitcha became SHA-3, but Blake is just beating it with Blake 2 and Blake 3. It just ran past it. Um, and I think with the Sphinx Plus method, SHA-3 doesn't work very well. It takes a while for SHA-3 to kick in after a while because of its sponge function. So you need quite a lot of data. But obviously with your method, you actually have quite small amounts of data. And I think if you look at I forget the name, it's left my head. It begins with H, the hashing method, but it's much faster. Do you think complying with NIST is really constraining us for getting these methods to work most efficiently?
This is a tricky question. It certainly, so yeah, I mean, SHA-3, the Keccak design starts with saying, let's use a 1600-bit permutation. And that's the internal structure, which gives a lot of breathing room compared to, for example, a lot of things happening in AES 128 are just working on a 128-bit block. And that's something which produces, for instance, a lot of applications only stay secure up to, well, they lose all security at, say, 2 to the 64 blocks encrypted with AES, which is a very feasible number of blocks to encrypt with AES. And already you see Amazon, for example, complaining about, hey, we're already seeing we don't have the security that we want because the 128 bits is just too small. And internally, Keccak goes for 1600 bits, which is just way beyond that and clearly solidly dealing with that problem. And because of how Keccak and related things are designed, I mean, there's all sorts of applications of that basic 1600-bit permutation. Because of how that's designed, it's okay to be from a not just a security perspective, but also from a performance perspective. If you're doing something like hashing a lot of data in hardware, then it's actually a very efficient design to be using that 1600-bit permutation, assuming you can afford the space in hardware to do that. But people have done hardware implementations, and it's actually very efficient in those situations. But then when you're doing a software implementation, you run out of registers for dealing with all the data in those 1600 bits, and you see other performance problems. And then, like you were saying, in some applications, you're only hashing, for instance, 256 bits of data. And then you just don't need 1600 bits of manipulation of those 256 bits to hash them successfully. And so Keccak has these trade-offs where sometimes, I mean, it's comforting in some ways, but sometimes it's, well, causing performance problems where, yeah, Blake 3 is definitely outperforming Keccak in lots of situations. And NIST said for the post-quantum competition, they only want people using NIST-approved symmetric crypto, except they made a few exceptions to that, but none that were typically something you could qualify for. Picnic was using one of those exceptions. But yeah, they put in that requirement, and it does mean that performance ends up being somewhat worse than it would be otherwise in lots of environments. So this is the sort of thing where it's interesting from a research perspective to figure out what's the best performance we can get for a given security level. For the real world rollout, well, a lot of times, thankfully, we can just afford anything, and then great, just pick the most secure thing and we're good. But if people are in situations where they have cost constraints, then it definitely becomes more complicated. And NIST definitely, a lot of their standards are behind what's possible in terms of performance. They're slowly trying to improve things. For instance, they did approve ED 25519, EDDSA as a standard a few years ago, but it's a slow process. And there's more competition when you look at when you say, oh, let's not just look at the at the standards, let's say, what's the best we can do, then it opens up lots more possibilities. Of course, also lots more room for people to make mistakes that destroy security. So you have to be very careful.
And obviously, Shakespeare, if he existed in a crypto world, would pose to pre-hash or not pre-hash. That's the question. So where do you stand on should we be pre-hashing our data for these delicate or more performance intense? Should we be pre-hashing data and feeding these little hashes in, or do you think we should be doing it the proper way of actually sending all our data in to these post-quantum signature methods?
So it is another one where if you can afford to do the all at once, then that's generally a safer thing to do. There's actually some pretty subtle security problems that can be caused by trying to allow pre-hashing. And that's something where if you say, I'll just, I mean, if you look at a typical signature system nowadays, which has gone through some review in, say, the post-quantum competition, then people will have said, okay, this is handling a message of whatever size. Is that something that it's doing in a safe way? And it's sort of part of the cryptographic boundary to say, yes, this is part of analyzing what the signature system is supposed to do. It's supposed to be secure for whatever length of messages, and it's going to be careful, hopefully secure in how it's handling that. If you pre-hash, then you get possibilities of things like, well, you pre-hash outside your trusted platform module or your hardware security module, and then you feed that pre-hash into your signature system, which, depending whether it's doing enough extra hashing at that point, this actually sometimes allows key extraction from HSMs. And it's those are not obvious attacks. They're typically, people have to work pretty hard to get those attacks working. And then, oops, if you allow pre-hashing, then suddenly a complicated attack breaks your system, and it wasn't obvious. That worries me, because I mean, if you have some sort of obvious thing that can go wrong, and people are then trying something and say, oh yeah, of course, don't do the following, then I mean, it might still go wrong, but at least there's lots of people who can notice it, lots of auditors who can notice it. If it's like a research paper to say, hey, this is something we can break in half an hour, then people don't notice it. And then people who are making mistakes with pre-hashing, well, they might deploy it, and no auditors are going to realize this until some researcher says, hey, let's look at this, and I can break that. And well, avoiding pre-hashing makes me feel more comfortable. Of course, there is a performance consequence when you have to take your entire message and provide that to your post-quantum system. If you've got a long message, then, well, you need the storage for that. There are some tricks to deal with the storage issues, but in general, there is a performance trade-off there.
So you'd be glad to know this is my last question. I could ask lots of other
I should get
questions.
going in a moment.
Yeah. So Cha-Cha 20. I mean, why did you come up with that? So that's not a NIST standard, but it's now a fairly well-defined standard in many systems now. So why did you create Cha-Cha 20 and Poly 1305?
So when I was putting these together, the typical situation, people were generally moving at that point to AES. So we're talking, say, 2004, 2005. AES was a standard proposed in 97. I think it was standardized in 2001. And then lots of people were saying, okay, yeah, this looks like a safe standard to use. But from an implementation perspective, AES is kind of scary. I was actually in my list before on the slides of recent TLS related security problems. One of those about the embed TLS library was exactly an attack that I was publishing a paper about in 2005, saying, okay, AES, according to the AES designers and according to NIST, AES is secure against timing attacks. They said that table lookups, which are the basic operation in fast AES software, table lookups take constant time. And this is an advantage of AES over some other possibilities that they did not select for standardization. But table lookups on most CPUs do not take constant time. And this is also how you can exploit recent versions of embed TLS today. And well, anyway, I was looking at that in the early 2000s and saying, this is kind of worrisome. And also from a performance perspective, it's definitely not the best that we can do. And okay, can't we have something? Plus, I mean, I was saying before, AES has only a 128-bit block. Even if you use AES 256, the block size is only 128 bits. And so all these things feel a little uncomfortable about AES, even though it seems to be mathematically secure for the notion of security it was aiming for. When you start plugging it into protocols and doing implementations, then you see it's actually kind of worrisome. Plus, again, not the fastest thing that not as fast as what you could do. And so there's another line of crypto systems, starting with TEA, the tiny encryption algorithm from Needham and Wheeler in the 90s. And that one is much easier to get right from an implementation perspective. And well, it wasn't very fast, but I was thinking, I could actually do something that looks like this, deal with the block size issue, gain speed, and then this should be an attractive alternative to AES. And it worked out. And I think in general, that line that started with the tiny encryption algorithm, the main thing that I was adding on to that design was thinking with a bigger block, you can do more stuff in parallel. And you can also parallelize across blocks. That would also work well with vector units, which were just starting to become popular at that point. And these things have helped Cha-Cha to keep up in performance with AES. Even when CPUs are adding AES hardware, AES is still not that much faster than Cha-Cha software. And so in general, I think that's worked out well. And I mean, there's still more to do with symmetric crypto. I think it would be nice to have an interface for symmetric crypto that's easier to use. I mean, right now people are faced with, well, you've got a symmetric cipher and it's got a nonce, like a message counter you have to be careful about. And then there's this authentication mechanism. And okay, these things maybe get integrated, but you still have to worry about all sorts of failure modes just because of how these get used. And it would be nice to use what are called wide block ciphers, which have a simpler interface than typical symmetric crypto today. NIST actually is working on something they call it an accordion mode, which means a wide block cipher produced from AES. Like a mode is they're thinking AES as the underlying cipher, and then the mode is producing a wide block cipher as a result. And I think in terms of API, that is the right direction to go for the API. Taking AES as the basis for that, well, NIST is doing that because that's their standard, but I think we can do better because after 25 years of timing attacks against AES being possible, I think we should say, all right, this is just too much of an implementation problem. Let's not do that.
Yeah, that's great. Well, thank you so much, and thanks for spending so long with us, giving us the presentation, and then chatting. I've certainly learned a great deal overall. So, could we have a virtual round of applause from the
Right.
audience, and enjoy the rest of your day. Thank you,
You too.
Daniel.
All right. Bye, everybody.
Bye bye.